Who wants to be the next Italian wine ambassador? Join an exclusive network of 400 Italian wine ambassadors across 48 countries. Vinitaly International Academy is coming to Chicago on October 19th to 21st, and to Almaty, Kazakhstan from November 16th to 18th. Don't miss out. Register now at vinitaly.com.
Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast Book Club. Each month we select a great wine book to share. We chat to the author and get your opinions. Stay tuned as we read Between the Vines with the Italian Wine Podcast. Hello and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. This month our guest is Andrew Jefford, a writer whose work I'm sure you're all already familiar with, not least because some of his writing is already featured on this show. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the show, Andrew. You're so highly regarded in the wine community that your name has already cropped up several times in our conversations on Book Club. So it's great to have this opportunity to speak to you in detail about your life and work. I'm also, as you can probably guess from my accent, passionate about Scottish whisky, so I'm looking forward to speaking to you about that aspect of your writing as well.
Great to be with you, Richard. Thank you.
First of all, let's talk about your background and early experiences of wine. I read in the introductory pages of your most recent book that you discovered the pleasure of wine in your early teens growing up in Norfolk. So without incriminating yourself, could you elaborate on that and tell us about your early relationship with wine?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Norfolk countryside, a wonderful place to grow up, I have to say. Lovely people and plenty of big sky overhead to dream at. My dad was a priest, an Anglican priest. I had two brothers, so that meant there were four males in the family. My poor mum was outnumbered. And fairly soon I decided that our usual rations, as far as alcohol was concerned, which was a bottle of cider for Sunday lunch, was probably not quite enough. And I decided that I had to do something about this. So I began making wine. Using, grape juice concentrate, but also carrots and nettles and elderflower and whatever else I could lay my hands on. Country wines, as they were called back then. We used to have a series of demijohns quietly plop, plop, plopping away in the background as we'd sit together in the evening. And that got me very interested in what wine was and the process of making it. That, if you like, was what sort of buried the seed. But it took a little while for the seed to sort of take and flourish. There was quite a long 10-year period before I ever came back to wine professionally, as it were.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm one of three boys as well, so I think my mum had similar problems. But I have to say my early experiences of wine were much less creative, I think, than yours. Yours were probably involved a suburban park somewhere in Glasgow where wine was merely an intoxicant. And in contrast also to my son who's growing up here in Italy, he has a completely different introduction to wine. But that's very interesting to hear that you started making wine at such an early age. You went on to study creative writing, and one of your classmates, I believe, was the Nobel Prize winning author Kazuo Ishiguro, author of, among other things, The Remains of the Day. What was that experience like, both the course in general, but also studying alongside someone like that?
Sure. A little correction. I wasn't actually on the creative writing course myself, although I did apply to go on it. But Malcolm Bradbury, who was running it at the time, suggested I actually did the MA course, which was a course in the 19th and 20th century novel comparative literature course, really. And so I did that, but he was kind enough to say I could sit in on the creative writing course alongside, I think there were 6 students that particular year. So I had a chance to watch all of that unfold. And yes, I did get to know Ish reasonably well. We were students together, all good friends. The creative writing students took 2 units from the taught MA course, and then they had the creative writing was another 2 units. So we spent at least half our time, taking courses together. It was a great experience. It was at University of East Anglia, which I heartily recommend as an educational establishment. That was certainly my happiest year of education anywhere throughout my entire academic trajectory. And of course, Ish was just one of the other students back then. He wasn't in any way a famous person. In fact, he sort of arrived on the course as a bit of a failure in a way, because he wanted to be, I think, the British Bob Dylan. He would want to be a songwriter, and he tried to get that career going, and it hadn't particularly taken off. And so, since he'd written a radio play or two, and quite liked the act of creative writing, and he fell back on that. And of course, well, the rest is history. It was great and interesting, and one of the pieces in the Valkyries book, a piece called Lessons from the Laureate, is in a way a sort of comparison between what he's been able to achieve in the literary field with what others might be able to achieve in the wine writing, in the wine creation field, in creating wines. It gave me a chance to think a little bit about that as well.
Okay, so how then, Andrew, did you transition into the wine industry? What were your early experiences as a wine writer?
Well, I spent between the postgraduate studies. In the end, I did three years of postgraduate study and wine writing, and the transition period between those was a period of 4 years as a book editor up in London, and actually that, I have to say, was an enormously useful time in terms of learning how to write well. I learned much more. I was working for a mass market publisher, Octopus Books, so we weren't working with famous authors. We were often working with celebrities who'd been asked to write a book, and they'd sort of happily agree. And then, I get a phone call about 3 weeks before the manuscript was due to say, having a little trouble here. Can you give me a hand?
Yeah.
And so, I was often working with pretty basic text, and I had to deconstruct the sentences and deconstruct the paragraphs and try and give it some order and make it work. And it was sort of car mechanics, the literary equivalent of car mechanics, really down at the bottom, grungy, dirty end of it all. And that was an enormously useful process. It got rather boring in the end, and I was keen to get out of it. But it did really help me when it came to actually writing for myself. So after 4 years, as I say, I was getting a little bit bored with it, and through publishing contacts, I heard about various wine projects that were going. In particular, a book somebody wanted written quickly and cheaply on port. I could be quick. I was definitely cheap. So I said, can I have a go? And they said yes. And that got reasonably well reviewed, that book. And that gave me the confidence to go freelance as well as a wine writer, sort of half editing, half writing. And fairly soon the wine writing took over. So that was really how I got into it. It was through the editing and the publishing side of things rather than the wine end of things. Although I have to say, when I first left university after the 6 years, I was sort of unemployed for a while, and I did work for 9 months at that point in a wine shop, one of the wine shops that Tony Lathwaite had at the time. So I did have some wine retail experience as well.
Yeah, that's interesting how these early experiences that can seem tedious at the time turn out actually to be extremely formative in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You describe winemaking as a craft rather than an art, but what parallels would you draw between storytelling and winemaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as journalistic writing is going, or let's say non-fiction writing is going, I believe the two activities are quite similar. In other words, in both cases, we'll set aside the wine growing aspect of it, but the wine making aspect, you're transferring or transforming or working with raw materials to craft and create a finished product. Obviously, you work with grapes if you're a winemaker, but you work with stories and narratives if you're a journalist or a non-fiction writer, or a body of material which you're trying to render intelligible and interesting. So it is that process of transforming raw materials with some craft and skill, which I think is common to the two. I think if you're writing fiction, it's a bit different because there you're inventing. And yet even then, nobody invents entirely in a vacuum. All writers are inventing based on drawing from the well of their own experience. So again, to some extent, it is a transformational process.
Yeah.
So I think that's really what they have in common.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about who you've been writing for, especially in those early days in your career?
Yeah, well, initially it was the two wine magazines that existed in the UK at that time. One was Decanter, still exists, of course, and then the other was called Wine, W-I-N-E, just one word, all capital letters. And that no longer exists, but was very buoyant and active at the time too. So I wrote quite a lot for those. And then after a while, I also got to write for the London Evening Standard, which was, a viable evening newspaper at the time. It isn't so any longer. It's a kind of free handout, and it's not at all what it once was. But for 10 years, it was a viable leading newspaper alongside other newspapers. It just happened to be a newspaper for the capital and the southeast, and it appeared in the evening. So I wrote for them for 10 years as well.
With quite a significant readership, I would think, as well.
Yes, and it was also a colossal cross-section readership.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, if you write for The Guardian, you're writing for Guardian readers, and if you write for the Mail, you're writing for Mail readers. We had the lot. We had everybody, including those who probably never read a morning newspaper as well.
Yeah, and also,
so it was wonderful to have that spread of audience, and of course it also enabled me to write about beer and whiskey and cognac and liqueurs and soft drinks and alcopops and the complete spectrum of beverage, which is something I really enjoyed and something I regret I haven't been able to do in the last 2 decades.
Yeah. And also, I suppose you're writing for a non-specialist audience.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And by the way, also we'll perhaps talk about all the people I write for later, but eventually a magazine called World of Fine Wine, the World of Fine Wine, came into being. I've been very heavily involved with that right from the beginning, so that's now something else I write for. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you're writing, the Evening Standard audience, compare that to the World of Fine Wine audience, it is completely different. And very important, actually, that you should always change your tone and style and pitch and the degree to which the manner in which you approach the subject significantly for all of those different audiences.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, you subsequently spent a year in Australia in 2009, I think that was.
Yes, that's correct. 15 months, actually.
Can you tell us a bit about that experience then? What took you to Australia? Was that a wine pursuit that took you to Australia or something else?
Yes, it was. I mean, I published a book called The New France. Actually, 2002 it came out. But, working on it around the change of the millennium. But also I'd given up writing for the Standard by then and was looking for other opportunities. And that book was done too quickly. It was done in 18 months. I'd love to have taken a couple of years over it, or 3 years, made it a bigger book. Anyway, it got quite well received. A lot of people liked it, and that was great. And then I wrote the Whisky book straight after that, all about Islay, which we'll talk about later. That was 2004, 2005. That was a big push.
Yeah.
And then I was hoping to go back and do more wine book writing, and particularly produce subsequent issues of the New France, with the idea of turning it into a sort of a perpetually updated reference publication, a la World Atlas of Wine or whatever. But the publishers at the time weren't interested. They got very distracted with a sort of quest to find the wine Jamie Oliver, and they wanted to put all their money into that. So that, I was sort of felt I wasn't really getting anywhere.
Right.
After 2 or 3 years of looking around for more book projects of that sort.
Yeah. So you're not the wine Jamie Oliver then.
The wine Jamie Oliver cannot exist because wine is different from food. That's what nobody actually grasped. They're completely different things, and
I guess it have been the personality they're interested in, or the marketability of that brand.
They thought it was all down to looks and personality and TV contracts, but the two subjects are just so different, and there's so much sort of intellectual grist involved in wine, and that's not true of food. You can go in at a much simpler level, and then the other things, everybody needs to eat 3 times a day. Nobody needs to drink a bottle of wine from one year's end to the next.
Well,
so they're completely different subjects, and that was never going to work, and they wasted actually an awful lot of money on that.
Okay,
great shame. However, in the meantime, I'd made friends with somebody who anyone who knows Australian wine will know well, Brian Crozer, and he invited me to come to Australia with family for a year. Within the context of a kind of an appointment at Adelaide University, sort of semi-wine writer in residence thing.
Right.
The idea was to then write a book like The New France about Australian wine, as well as to report from Australia for all the people I was writing for in the UK at the time, which by then also included World of Fine Wine. So that's what we all did. It never did turn into a book, for a lot of complicated reasons, which I can go into if you like, but I think would actually be a little bit dull for everybody to listen to. So that was how that happened, and we went there and we had a wonderful year, and I learned an awful lot about Australian wine and did a fair amount of reporting, did some teaching, got thoroughly involved in the scene over there and contributed to the extent to which I felt I could contribute.
Yeah.
But after that, we came back. But of course, everything was packed up. Our house was rented out. We had 2 children who were about to start school at that time. And we weren't wildly happy about our situation in the UK. I mentioned the work situation. I could always also smell the stink of Brexit beginning to develop. I could see all these horrible
stench,
purple posters appearing all over the countryside. I could see that craziness begin to set in. It was actually quite hard to make a living. So we weren't enormously enthusiastic about going back to the UK. And since we had the wonderful opportunity as UK citizens to go and live in Europe if we wished at that time, we decided to avail ourselves of that, and went and gave France a try and moved to France in 2010.
Wow.
And we've been here ever since.
Always in the same place?
Yes, always in the same place.
The right place at the right time? Or?
Well, yeah, maybe. But actually more to do with the fact that the children went to school and they soon made friends, and then they felt rooted and they had their little local environment and it was their place. And so, we stuck here. Well, also, it for my wife too, because she had to find work locally.
Yeah.
Obviously, I could sort of work anywhere, but it took her some time. She's a dance movement therapist, so it took her some time to put out the sort of professional roots one needs to locally.
Yeah.
So for those 2 reasons, the children and her work, we've stayed where we are.
Okay, great. And no regrets then about the decision to relocate to France?
None at all. I mean, France isn't perfect. No country's perfect. We discovered in Australia that wasn't perfect either. And we certainly knew all along that the UK wasn't perfect. There is no perfect country. So, it's always a dappled picture. But yeah, I mean, there are many, many wonderful things about France. And broadly speaking, we've been super happy here. We've applied for our French citizenship. We can be dual nationals. Bureaucracy is one of the things that's not wonderful about France. So
you should try Italy.
We're still waiting and twiddling our thumbs and wishing we could vote in the upcoming election, but we are still waiting. Eventually, I guess we'll get it, and then we'll be back to being what we always wanted to be. One of the things that moved me most in my lifetime, one of the great achievements that politics ever delivered to me as a citizen, which was that European passport.
Yeah.
And we'll have the European passport again.
Yeah. Yeah, good for you. It's probably a subject we could compare notes on for a long time. I came over to Verona with my family in 2011, so not long after you settled in France. And like you, no regrets, but as you say, there's no perfect country. But Verona as a city, I think, comes pretty close.
Great.
Anyway, as I said, we could probably talk about that topic and Brexit and all the rest of it for quite some time. But let's move on to your most recent book, Drinking with the Valkyries. Can you tell us first just about the significance of that title? What does that mean?
Okay, well, it's a collection of writings, drawn over the last 10, 12, 15 years. And so that's the name of one of the pieces in the book. It was the title the publishers particularly liked. They felt it was catchy and all the rest. So we went with that.
Evocative, I think, even without properly understanding what it means, it does have a certain emotive force.
Yep. But anyway, Valkyries, you don't actually want to meet a Valkyrie if you can help it. They're the choosers of the slain in Norse mythology. So having chosen the slain, they then guide the souls of the dead warriors off to Valhalla. So they're not enormously comforting figures, but they're often serving drinks. They're holding horns full of mead and things like that. But they're often hanging around with ravens. Obviously, the ravens are going to clear away the physical remains. And they're kind of, intriguingly dangerous and sexy at the same time. So they're sort of sinister, but at the same time attractive figures. And this is in particular a piece about drinking vintage port, not waiting the obligatory, or often what's often said to be obligatory 20 or 30 years for it to soften and turn into sort of super duper 5-star ruby port, but to actually drink it when it's young, freshly bottled, which I think is one of the most exciting wine drinking experiences anybody can procure for themselves. But I admit, if you're not ready for it, it can be a slightly sort of frightening experience. So that's why I used that title. And of course, I was also thinking about the Ride of the Valkyries from Wagner's Ring, which most people, I suspect, will know via its use in Coppola's Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
The music that gets blasted out from the helicopters when they come roaring over the horizon to shoot up the Vietnamese village and napalm the whole place.
That's right.
So, all of that was bustling about in the background. In other words, this is a very, very exciting but slightly terrifying wine drinking experience. And actually, you can't say that about many of them. So that was why we featured that.
Okay, very good, very good. And your passion for port comes across really clearly in that article as well, and especially, as you said, for that young vintage port. Another chapter that I particularly enjoyed very early on in the book, where you suggest that drinking wine by candlelight or by firelight is one of the few intimate daily acts that we share with those who have gone before us. And that also we are, as humans, as a culture driven by this deep imperative to consume alcohol. So I found that incredibly reassuring, the fact that we are almost genetically programmed to drink alcohol. I found that incredibly reassuring as someone who probably drinks a little bit too frequently. So does that mean that efforts to encourage or enforce abstention are doomed to failure?
I think they are doomed to failure. A little bit of background on that first. That piece, which is called Homo Imbibens, is actually based on the work of Patrick McGovern, who is a sort of bioarchaeologist, done a lot of work on analysing very, very ancient residues of beverages from the distant past. He and his colleagues, I mean, not actually directly him, but he and his colleagues have been responsible for, a number of the kind of landmark breakthroughs. In particular, the oldest ever recorded residues of an alcoholic beverage, which go back 9,000 years to China, and also the oldest pure residues of wine, which go back 8,000 years to Georgia. So for at least 8,000 or 9,000 years, we have been drinking this stuff. And as Patrick points out, we need our bodies need to be able to produce a particular enzyme in order to deal with alcohol. And we've actually had that enzyme. We've evolved that enzyme in our biochemistry from much further back than just those 8,000 or 9,000 years. So we've probably been drinking or eating or whatever fermented fruits in order to procure some kind of mood enhancement for much, much longer than that, though the proof is wanting. So yes, life is tough, life is difficult, life is miserable for many people, brutal, short. This has often been said, and it's clearly true when you look at the lives people have had in the past, indeed the lives many people still have to live at the moment. They are full of misery and discomfort. And faced with all of that, and faced simply with the existential challenge of living too, which is also very difficult at times, we seem to need some palliative, something that helps us exactly that, with mood enhancement, with lifting our spirits, with a little recreational repose in the evening when work is done. And alcohol, I happen to believe, is the best of all of the substances we found in order to do that with. It's not the only one, of course. You can speak of tea and coffee in that sort of respect. Obviously, there's tobacco products. Nowadays, we have a huge panoply of other pharmaceuticals. There's marijuana, increasingly competing, I think, with wine. So I wouldn't say it's simply alcohol. I wouldn't say it's just alcohol, but we do need we do seem to need one or other of these substances. The Muslim world, for example, bans alcohol. Not 100%, because we all know there are plenty of exceptions to that rule. Plenty of people producing and consuming alcohol within Muslim societies. But even amongst those who strictly adhere to that ban, the use of tobacco is still very popular. Tea is still very popular. Who knows? Perhaps there are other substances which are consumed for that purpose as well. So it does seem to me that humans just need that palliative in order to help them get through the very, very difficult moments that life throws up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, broadly speaking, that's what that piece is about, although it particularly focuses, of course, on alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Patrick McGovern there, and I think one of the things I also really appreciated about your writing is how you take these, what are often extremely complex or academic arguments, and make them not only understandable but also enjoyable to read. Is that something that you're conscious of when you're writing this, your role in a way as an educator?
Well, perhaps in the background, but I mean, in the foreground, I'm very definitely against received ideas, against unquestioning acceptance of the status quo, against what we could call the geeky side of the wine world, and also against the sort of hieratic or priestly role of the wine writer. Very much against all of those things. And there are, of course, other pieces in the book, notably Wine and Astonishment, the sort of philosophical heart of the book, that are very much against those things as well. So yes, to me, the posture, I suppose, of the wine writer should always be that of astonishment. It should be that of somebody actually rather innocent who's wandering suddenly into the realization of what these extraordinary beverages and the places they come from and the people that produce them can open up for us. And sometimes it is very complex, but yes, I would always try and make it as palpable for the newcomer and as evident and as obvious for the newcomer as I can, in order to inspire people, not to put them off, but to inspire them. I think all of those other things, the received ideas, the exceptions of the status quo, which is enormously, there's colossal superstructure of all of that in the wine world, the geeky stuff and the priestly role, tend to put people off, and I lament that. So definitely trying to get away from that.
Yeah. Another thing that I really appreciate about your anthology is how it shifts effortlessly from place to place, from one article to the next. So we could be in the south of France and then Napa Valley and then Japan. So it covers a lot of ground, a lot of different wine producing, wine making, wine drinking regions. Which wine regions are of interest to you or are most exciting you at the moment?
This is quite a difficult question, Richard, because I try to stay interested in everything, and actually everything is pretty interesting. So it's simply a question of what one's work gives one the chance to do. But anyway, let's play the game a bit. And
let me put it this way then: if you had a mysterious benefactor of the kind you describe in the book, and he offered you a sum of money that would allow you to buy a vineyard, where would you
Well,
invest?
Again, I'm going to disappoint you, I'm afraid, because I would definitely not buy a vineyard. It's all about skill sets, and I just know that the skill set that you need to make that kind of business and enterprise work is not the skill set that I hold. So even though for the piece you refer to, which is a piece at the beginning of the book called The Blue Corrupter, I did speculate about, inheriting money and buying a vineyard in Bordeaux. The serious truth is that I wouldn't be buying a vineyard anywhere.
Okay.
I think, obviously, I live in France, so I take a keen interest in French wine. I live in Languedoc, I take a keen interest in Languedoc wine.
Yeah.
But perhaps the places that have excited me most in recent years would be Italy for sure, because Italy is a sort of inexhaustible resource, and every time you dig deeper, you find even more to explore. So Italy for sure. I think in the Southern Hemisphere, probably Argentina, which seems to me the most exciting source at present of Southern Hemisphere wine, although every part of the Southern Hemisphere can produce super interesting wines too. California, because I think the greatest wines so far produced outside Europe have probably been produced in California. And then the UK, of course, because climate change, something very significant for the wine world, clearly a major force at work in the wine world. Many, many losers from climate change, even more in the decades to come. But one potential gainer, although the losses will definitely outweigh the gains in other respects, would be the UK. So that, I guess those would be the four places which perhaps I would rush back to most quickly, given the chance to go and do work there.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned Italy, which our audience of Italian wine podcast listeners will be pleased to hear.
Are you enjoying this podcast? There is so much more high-quality wine content available from Mama Jumbo Shrimp. Check out our new wine study maps or books on Italian wine, including Italian Wine Unplugged and much, much more. Just visit our website, mamajumboshrimp.com. Now, back to the show.
I want to go to your first reading. This is from the chapter entitled Angela's Lemon, and it describes the heroic winemaking of the Cinque Terre. And it's this particularly remarkable encounter that you have with an elderly winemaker, Angela Capellini.
It was the smoke I saw first, then a slight figure dressed in lilac with pink trousers, a russet scarf, and a striped pink hat moving about nearby. She was quietly tidying her tiny vineyard in readiness for spring and raking a little grass debris into a companionable bonfire. Her husband had died. She had 2 children, both of whom worked in offices. She was 82, and she looked younger. Her legs were fine, we learned in reply to our inquiry. Well, they'd need to be. Her home was a great many stone steps beneath us. There was a lemon tree in the vineyard, and she offered us each a lemon. So good, she said, that she sometimes just peeled one and ate it. It was hard not to be elated in that extraordinary environment, talking to one of Europe's oldest wine growers, 300 meters above the fishes, surrounded by wild oregano, wild asparagus, and sweet-scented tree heather, and with the sappy freshness of the 2014 Cinque Terre Costa d'Aposa perfuming our breath. Hard, too, not to reach facile conclusions about health, long life, and the indomitability of the wine-growing act. Yet a week later, I remembered what Matteo Bonanini's words were in reply to our first questions. Tanti problemi. Perhaps Angela deserved a rest. Perhaps her children deserved their office jobs. And perhaps the future of the Cinque Terre lies in hiking and honeymoons rather than haunting white wines. Perhaps, too, I'll try eating Angela's lemon to find out if there can be any sweetness in that which is intrinsically sour.
Wonderful. So that reading explores the extraordinary challenges of winemaking in the Cinque Terre, not least the terrain and the destabilizing impact of mass tourism on the region. So how would you assess the challenges and the opportunities of winemaking in the Cinque Terre and in Italy more generally?
Well, I think the Cinque Terre really does face colossal challenges because it has to be all done by hand and it has to be all done by foot. Of course, you can use, tiny little funicular railways to get fruit up and down, but it's got to be very, very expensive viticulture if it's going to survive. In other words, it really has to be like Swiss viticulture, the sort of vineyards that you find in the Valais, for example, or elsewhere in Switzerland. And of course, those wines can be sold for 50 or 100 euros a bottle because they're sold into the Swiss market, and because there's, Swiss pride and Swiss commitment connected with them. Switzerland doesn't have a lot of other sorts of viticulture. It's either that or nothing. And the Swiss are determined to carry on with that and to reward it. But in the Italian context, that isn't true at all. And we have to say that, they're not producing Barolo on those slopes. They're not producing Brunello di Montalcino on those slopes. They're not even producing Etna wines on those slopes. They're producing basically fresh, attractive, unique, but relatively quaffable white wine. In other words, the sort of white wine that you would begin to scratch your head if you were asked to pay 50 or 60 euros for. So I just don't quite see the economics of turning Cinque Terre into a Swiss-style vineyard really adding up in the future. So I'm sure people will always make wines there. And of course, the tourist market will always mean that there is a market for some Cinque Terre wine. But as a sort of viable indigenous Vin de Terroir style wine, I'm not sure it really has much of a future. And really, the piece was sort of trying to face up to the honest reality of that, and saying, if the economics don't justify the continued activity, then the continued activity is going to go away. That's just what happens. It has to be what happens. That's how evolution works.
Yeah.
So that was the bittersweet thoughts that we ended up with at the end of that text.
And Angela's lemons being the perfect metaphor for that.
Indeed, that was the point, really.
Yeah. Okay. On the topic of food and wine, I know from reading your book that you're reluctant to offer food and wine recommendations. But what is your suggested approach then to pairing food with wine?
Well, it would have two prongs. One is common sense, and the other is experiment and serendipity. I find the whole, superstructure of food and wine pairing and the instructions and the discussions of it as if we all had the opportunity to drink absolutely anything and to eat absolutely anything, and we had all the resources in the world. It's all just a bit beside the point. It's not really of practical use for most of us. Equally, the sort of recommendations for food and wine pairing that you get on the backs of bottles of supermarket wine are sort of banal and useless too, because they're so vague.
Yes.
As I explore in that piece, if you're really going to come across wonderful food and wine combinations, then you have to be very, very specific about, exactly what dish, exactly what ingredients, exactly the way you put it together. Because, the moment you start to make that dish somewhere else with other ingredients in a different kitchen and different percentages and different proportions and so on, you'll quickly lose this sort of exquisite moment of the perfect combination. I don't deny that perfect combinations exist. I just don't think you can particularly write rules or give advice on them. I just think you have to use your own palate, and of course palates vary in this respect too. Not everybody wants to drink the perfect recommended wine with the perfect recommended food, because they may not much like that wine. They may prefer, not to drink a 30-year-old dry Riesling from the Tsar. They may prefer red wine. So why should they have to go and drink this wine they don't like much? So you just need to use your common sense. You need to think about the way combinations work. Use your mouth, use your senses. You'll quickly develop some experience in this respect, and those will guide you to future experiments. And after that, just have fun with it, and let the mood take you where it will.
Yeah, good advice. And don't read the back of the supermarket label.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. And one of the other articles that I really loved, in fact, two that I thought conveyed a common theme. Wine is also a dream. You talk about wine's cultural depth and history. but also about the importance of the bottle, the label, and even the cork to that whole experience. And then in Lucky Us, you write very movingly, I think, about enjoying a glass of what you describe as flabby, semi-sweet soup of a wine with your elderly father. So I wondered then, to what extent is context in which you're drinking or experiencing the wine more important than the content of the bottle when it comes to enjoying a glass of
Well,
wine?
I'm very glad you picked up on these two texts, Richard, because they're almost, for me, the sort of the two central texts of the whole book. Wine is Also a Dream was actually my suggestion for the title of the book. And to me, it's really a very, very important text within the book. Yes, I mean, I don't think anybody ever talks much about this because it's almost apostasy on the part of wine people to say that actually the aroma and flavour of the wine may not be the most important thing about the wine. But my point is, it may not be. What is most important about the wine for most people, most of the time, actually, is what I call the dream of the wine they're tasting. In other words, it's everything that, first of all, wine culturally represents, and the 2,000 years at least of history in that, and there's the Christian Eucharist behind that, and there's all sorts of other, there's Homer's Odyssey behind that, and everything that our cultural patrimony has given to us connected with wine, lots of biblical analogies and allusions to wine as well. So all of that is behind every glass of wine building the dream. And then there's also, the dream of where those wines have come from and what they mean within our cultures and everything that we've said about them and all the prices that they've achieved down the years and all of that too. It all builds the dream. Every wine is actually offering us a different dream. And I think very often when we choose the wines we drink, we're actually principally choosing the dreams and enjoying the dreams. And I've even noticed this with, super geeky wine writers that they'll go on and geek on about, this wine or that wine because it ticks so many of their mental boxes. It's just, everything about it is exactly right. It's exactly what they want to talk about. It's completely their particular dream. And then I taste this wine and honestly, it's not very nice. It's sort of, it's too dry or too hard or too acid or whatever, too much this or too much that. It's not a beautiful wine, but it completely satisfies their dream. And these are people who's, dedicate their lives to wine. So even for those kind of people, actually, truly, the dream is more important than actually the contents of the bottle. And as I point out at the beginning of that piece, if you were to imagine, if anybody listening to this was to imagine the next year of their drinking, every single wine they're going to drink in the next year, they can have exactly whatever wine they want, whatever wine they're going to have next year, except that every single one of those wines will be delivered to them in a medical sample bottle with no label. Okay? It'll be delivered to them in that way. And they will have to drink it from a medical sample bottle with no label. Are they going to enjoy what they're going to drink next year as much as they would if they drank it from all the bottles with all the labels that they're going to acquire? Of course not. It's going to be an enormously depressing and disappointing experience because they'll be exactly the same wines, but they'll have had the dreams ripped away from them. There'll be nothing left. There'll be no dream residue left. And in that case, you can't enjoy wine. The wine just ceases to be a pleasure. I mean, it'll have some alcoholic force, but, you might as well have been drinking, vodka and lime or, White Claw or something. Well, not quite, because it does taste different, of course. But, my point is that without the dream, wine suddenly diminishes enormously and would cease to be of much interest to us. Yeah. So, I conclude from that the dream may be most of what we actually enjoy about the wine rather than the wine itself.
Yeah. And I think much of that also applies to whiskey as well, I think, Andrew, which we are going to come on to discuss in a moment.
Very percipient of you. You're absolutely right. And we'll talk about that when you're ready.
Yeah. Let's take your second reading then from that chapter that we've just been discussing. Wine is also a dream. And what I love about this is just how it explores why wine commands our attention and what makes it so special.
Wine commands our attention because it commands our emotions. And the way in which it does that is the first building block in our mental construction of a wine's personality. We can't feel about a Moselle Cabinet, pure, pristine and filigree, in the same way we feel about a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, warming, rich and powerful, principally because the latter is twice as strong as the former, as we will realise after half a glass. But after 3 glasses of either, we're emotionally engaged with the wine in a way that we never will be with fruit juice or a soft drink, no matter how subtle. The second element of wine's dream force is its cultural depth. The magnificent texts that in part marked the birth of the European literary tradition, Homer's Odyssey, brims with acts of wine drinking. Indeed, its plot at one point relies on wine's intoxicating effect. Odysseus and his men blind the Cyclops by plunging a burning olive wood stake into his single eye, only because he's dead drunk and covered in vomit, a mixture of wine and half-digested human flesh. The world's largest religion in terms of number of followers asked worshippers to sip wine at the moment of greatest significance in its key ritual. Office workers heading out for a glass of Pinot Grigio after work on Friday aren't consciously thinking of either an oral narrative poem in ancient Greek or of the Christian Eucharist, but both are there nonetheless, onerically, quietly haunting the act those office workers are about to engage in. Wine's history is there too, clinging like barnacles to the hull of the dream and sinking it more deeply into our consciousness. Pepys drinking Haut-Brion in the Royal Oak, the Prince de Conti and La Pompadour squabbling over what we now call Romanée-Conti, or Napoleon quaffing Chambertin, diluted with water, en route, the disaster in Moscow, all add the dream force of each wine. This happened. Geoffrey Chaucer's father was a wine merchant, yes. If Falstaff could rhapsodize Sherris Sack so memorably, it was because the actor-playwright William Shakespeare took pleasure, seated with friends in London's late 16th century taverns, in tasting it, drinking it, and noting how its nimble, fiery, and delectable shapes become excellent wit, as we can do the same.
Wonderful. Again, really compelling to hear that. And just so clear as well that, it's obvious that apple juice, for example, I would never emotionally engage with apple juice.
Exactly.
But to actually stop and think about why that is very interesting.
Well, it is the intoxicatory force which engages the emotion.
Yeah. And then also, I think, the history and the culture that surrounds it and the context.
Yes, and the dream force too. Yeah, those two things working together.
Yeah. What advice would you give, Andrew, to aspiring wine writers or anyone who's involved in that kind of work, particularly in relation to tasting and describing wines?
Well, I think the most important thing for young wine writers to do is not to read too much wine writing, but to read lots and lots of other sorts of journalism, particularly perhaps specialist journalism, and be inspired by that and see how other people describe other things, see how other people open up different worlds to people. A lot of wine journalism as it exists at the moment today, particular, the endless tasting notes, I find tedious in the extreme and very uninspiring. So I would caution them against glugging back too much of that stuff. And then when it comes to actually trying to describe wines, well, go easy on the analogies, because a list of 30 analogies, even if you are truly reminded of all those things, which I often doubt, is exceptionally tedious and doesn't communicate anything to anyone. Look for form, look for structure, look for substance, look for sorts of energy, look for the elements of a wine. Try and talk about those rather than, spouting analogies.
Yeah. Okay. Good. One other aspect that I wanted to discuss with you was talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. It's something now that we've kind of tended to try to forget about, I think, in our lives, to put behind us. But it was a very poignant chapter, I think you wrote, All Quiet, that describes daily life and the enhanced importance of wine during the lockdown. Can you share maybe something of your experience of lockdown and why wine was so important during that time?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it was a strange time for everyone, of course, and I can readily imagine that it was a very uncomfortable time for a lot of people, particularly if you had limited living space to which you were, as it were, in which you were imprisoned, and particularly with young children, it must have been extraordinarily difficult. We were in a slightly more fortunate position in that we have a little bit of living space, but we also had the opportunity to take walks. We live really on the edge of the city. We can walk out into the countryside. And our children were older, so although they were, at home, they weren't kind of going stir crazy in the way that little children would have done. So for me, it was rather a positive time in many ways, broadly positive. The connection with nature had a chance to be much stronger than it would be normally if I was working normally. It was a chance to think and reflect. It was a peaceful time. It was good family time, actually. We got to know each other all much better.
Yeah.
It was a bit like a year or two of Sundays. So I quite enjoyed all of that. Of course, there were financial anxieties, but we got through those okay. I've always been somebody who's, because I've always been a freelance worker, that's not always a terribly comfortable position to be in, but you quickly learn that you always need a financial reserve. So for the rainy day or for whatever might happen. So as a freelance worker, I'd always had a financial reserve, so you could draw on that during the lockdown period. And also, of course, I could carry on writing and be paid for my writing. So I accept that I was in a very privileged position, but for us, it was quite a positive experience. And particularly the sort of the quietness of it was something I relished, because I'm not somebody who loves being in noisy environments.
Yeah, interesting.
Indeed, I suffer from quite a lot of hearing loss nowadays anyway, so noisy environments are physically as well as mentally uncomfortable for me now. So lots of things I quite liked about lockdown.
Interesting, and I love that comparison to it's like a never-ending rainy Sunday afternoon, probably would be one way to describe it. Let's take your third reading, which is from Lucky Us, and it describes a special tasting of a 1914 vintage. But I think more importantly than that, it gives you this wonderful snapshot of you enjoying a glass of wine with your elderly parents. I find it incredibly moving.
Changes in personal circumstances, too, can reframe the way in which we see wine, rendering what would have once seemed consequential irrelevant. My parents, now in their mid-80s, have always enjoyed wine in a normally casual sort of way. My mother has Alzheimer's, and all the landmarks in her world have been washed downstream. My father, who cares for her, was recently scourged by bladder stones and subsequently diagnosed with prostate cancer, which he's probably had for a decade, and then bone cancer. Shopping is no longer an easy exercise, and my dad has taken to ordering the occasional inexpensive case of wine from UK mail-order specialist Laithwaite's. We try to chat every evening on the phone. Eating and drinking is almost the last pleasure left for my mother, and the last activity in which she has a little autonomy, though we have to dissuade her from pouring her coffee onto her breakfast cereal and her wine onto her dinner. My father, though he remains admirably cheerful, needs the psychological restoration that a glass or two of wine at the end of the day can effect. Wine has never meant more to them or brought more benefit than it does just now. I was staying with them recently, and my dad opened what is apparently the most reordered red from the Laithwaite's list, a Côte Catalane called Cabalier, made not far from where I live. Grenache from hereabouts can be arresting, but this was a flabby, semi-sweet soup of a wine, its fruit evanescent, without redeeming tannin or extract. "Gosh, it's good," my dad said. We smiled hugely, toasted each other, and knocked it back. Lucky us, still together, still with wine in our glasses.
Wonderful. And I think it really captures just the significance of context and enjoying wine with your family and your loved ones, regardless in some ways of what's actually in the bottle.
Yeah.
That's certainly the case with whiskey, or it certainly can be. So I want to talk, if we can, about your whiskey writing. You published Peat, Smoke and Spirit back in 2004, which was then republished as Whisky Island, a portrait of Islay and its whiskies in 2020. So it struck me that those years between 2004 and 2020 have coincided with a remarkable resurgence in Scotch whisky, and in particular in single malt Scotch whisky. So what for you are the factors behind that resurgence? And what, if anything, can the wine trade learn from the whisky industry?
Yes, a very interesting question. Well, to me, it again reinforces the importance of storytelling and the importance of the dream. Because, what is whiskey? It's basically distilled beer. It's made in the same way everywhere. In other words, well, there are two distilling methods. You can either use a pot still as you would for malt whiskey, or a continuous still as you would for grain whiskey, and then put the two together as in blended whiskey. But essentially, every whiskey distillery is the same as every other whiskey distillery. And the raw materials are essentially the same too. I mean, there are decisions to be made about whether you use peat in the preparation of the malt. And there are differences, tiny differences, which can be reflected in the final quality of the spirit, notably to do with the equipment that you use in the still house and the way you run the stills. But fundamentally, it's an industrial process. There's even more sameness, if you like, about it than there is with wine. I mean, much, much more, because wine is an agricultural product and an agricultural process. Winemaking is the processing of an agricultural crop in a way that really isn't true for whiskey at all. So whiskey could be very, very dull for consumers to come to. And indeed, for many, many years, it was pretty dull to come to, because the distilleries and the big companies that owned the distilleries weren't terribly interesting in revealing what they saw as their secrets, and they weren't very good at communicating anything other than the basic attraction of the product. And then the great revolution really was the realization on the part of distilling companies that Scotland, the idea of Scotland, and particularly Scotland's wilderness, which is where most of its malt whisky is produced, is an enormously attractive thing for people to learn about and read about. The dream of Scotland, and we're talking about Scotch whisky obviously here, is what lies behind a lot of the communication and the marketing and the design that goes into Scotch whisky sales. A perfect example of this is the cult of the water. It's the water that matters, and all this wonderful, pure, wild loch water flowing off the hill is why the whisky tastes so good. Which actually, if you talk to whisky technicians, they will quickly poo-poo and say that's not the case at all. On Islay, for example, most of the water used for distilling is brown loch water. And when I first set out to try and research the book, I assumed that this really did have quite a substantial significance, but I was quickly put right on that. And the manager of Lagavulin at the time said he'd much rather use a municipal supply. If he could get hold of it, it would be much less problem, and the whisky wouldn't be any different. So that's a good example of, as it were, the necessity to sell a dream, triumphing the practical realities of production.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think the whisky industry, and Scotch whisky industry in particular, has been absolutely fantastic in terms of packaging and labeling and marketing and storytelling, much, much better actually than the wine world. And I think a lot of that is what's driven the great boom in whisky connoisseurship.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is that partly though because, I mean, a lot of these distilleries are now owned by massive international conglomerates with huge marketing departments and budgets, whereas, that's not necessarily the case in relation to wine, where wineries tend still to be family owned?
That is certainly a factor, Richard, for sure. No question of that. But even so, if you compare, we now have quite a lot of farm distilleries or artisanal distilleries or small-scale distilleries. There's been a huge revolution in that. And again, as far as whiskey is concerned, it's still all distilled beer. And, a consignment of grain, I mean, there are people who disagree with this, of course. But, from my point of view, as far as I can see and as far as I can tell, and from what I've understood by speaking to whisky technicians, one delivery of grain is not enormously different to another, except insofar as it may or may not be peated to a greater or lesser extent. And as we've just sort of briefly alluded to, many people in the whiskey business don't consider water to be an enormously significant factor. The significant factors always for flavour will be the malt recipe, i.e. whether there's peat or not, the distilling equipment, the way you run the stills, and then the aging protocols, and in particular the type of wood and the age of wood you're using. And that's where the character and the difference between whiskies essentially is going to come from. And those are not terroir factors. Those are decisions you make. Those are sort of elements of your personal craftsmanship, of your final product. And I think it would be very hard, if not impossible, to, let's say, take a whiskey that was made in exactly the same way, from exactly the same ingredients, in Wales, in Ireland, in Scotland, in the USA, and in Japan, and truly tell the difference. Probably that the main way of doing that would be to separate out the American whiskey, because the aging conditions are rather warmer there than in those other places. But even so, when we taste American whiskey against Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey or Japanese whiskey, the thing we're noticing essentially is the oak use, the sort of oak that's being used, and the powerful effect that has on the final flavour. So again, it belongs more to the world of industry than it does to agriculture. And terroir is a relatively mute voice in all of that. So I do think the two worlds are very, very different. And I think, therefore, it behoves those involved in producing whiskey to major on their story to a much, much greater extent. In the wine world, it's always enough, and many wine producers just completely stop at that, to say, okay, well, these are my grape varieties, this is my vineyard, this is where I'm making wine, this was a vintage. End of story.
Yeah.
You can never do that.
Again, it's a topic I could certainly talk about all day, but I'm conscious of time. What is it about Islay that makes it so special as a whiskey-producing island?
Well, the reason it was a whiskey-producing island, or it was the whiskey-producing island par excellence, is really a function of its topography, because it's a lower-lying island sited further south than the others, and because historically, peat was the fuel used on the island, and so in the early days, it was simply a place that was making use of local raw materials, and that was what led to it becoming very significant in whiskey production in a way that a much rockier island with more difficult weather, like the Isles of the Outer Hebrides or Skye, for example, it wasn't to the same extent. So that was what led it to being a significant island. Of course, nowadays its significance is because it has these major and now farm distilleries too. So distilling is a more central part of the island's identity than is true for any other island. Because it is an island, that's also a great attraction. It's cut off by a huge tract of water from anywhere else, apart from Jura, small tract of water in that case. And so that lends allure and luster and romance, really, to the production of whiskey there. And because of course, all the cultural wealth and knowledge and understanding that goes with that, and the storytelling that you can do around that. I remember when I first went to Islay, and I'd already been writing about wine for a good 15 years by then. And I my mind was sort of blown by it. It just seemed to me I have a love for wild, lonely, remote, savage places, but it just seemed to me such an extraordinary, beautiful, wonderful, inspiring place to write about. And really, that was why I wanted to write the book. I just wanted an excuse to keep going back to Islay fairly regularly over a short period, and to be very nosy and inquisitive and have an excuse to go and talk to people when I got there. So that was why I wanted to do that. It had an enormous personal appeal to me. I tried to convey that as best I could through all the different ways. I was able to do that in the book. And if it inspires other people to go there and discover it for themselves, so much the better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you say it's a wild, lonely and remote landscape, but it's also a very friendly island, as most of the islands are. I think I visited Ireland in 2018. We stayed in a lovely little cottage at Ardbeg, passing Lafroig and Lagavulin on the way. So quite an amazing place to be. But the thing that my kids loved the most was that as we drove past another vehicle, they would always wave.
The Islay wave.
So there was this, they just loved it. Yeah, the Islay wave. Yeah, they just loved this. The fact that every single person on the island, as you passed them in the car, they would wave at us, which certainly isn't always the case in Italy.
Indeed not. Or in France either. I hope that's still the case, actually.
Yeah.
I haven't been back for many years, and I want to get back one day, of course. But I hope that's still the case, and I hope it hasn't been spoilt by the influx of visitors that have gone there for all sorts of reasons since I was writing the book.
Yeah, I guess it's something similar to Cinque Terre. You have this massive influx of visitors, this massive influx of interest in the whisky, but that's also something that has to be managed and harmonised with the needs of the local community.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to your writing habits. How do you get in the mood to write?
I think probably exercise is the most important for that. I always begin every morning with a run, and then I do some exercises, and moving around rapidly early in the days I find perfect for setting one up, to do some writing. And then on the days in which I have to write, which is certainly a minority of the days, my working days, mostly I'm doing other things, but when I do have a chance to write, I try and turn everything else off and not look at the inbox and, just go for it during that day. Be very, very focused when you're actually doing it, and very acute, and listen to every nuance of every sentence that you're writing, and try and get them all working in the right way and working together. And then a general advice to aspiring wine writers is really keep your mind broad. Don't get so sucked into the wine world that you become, a total geek or a wine obsessive, because you'll then write, geeky stuff that will have an audience, of course, of other geeks, but you're never going to appeal to a broader readership. And in fact, I think that sort of writing puts the broader readership off quite a lot, which is why the wine world has become something of a ghetto, which is a great shame, and not to its benefit. So keep your mind broad, keep it being inspired by other sorts of writing, other sorts of inquiry, other sorts of literary endeavour, other ways of writing even, not just the wine writerly way of writing. Whoever turns you on as a writer, try and incorporate that and be inspired by that in your own work. We need a much, much greater diversity and breadth of styles within wine writing. I recognise, of course, that this isn't just down to writers. It would also require editors, indulgent editors. And sometimes that isn't the case. I know full well from my own experience. Even so, I still think if you write well in a slightly different way, people will see that there's something there and they will respond well to that. And that's definitely what we need more of in the wine world.
Excellent. Good advice. And what about reading for pleasure? What's on your bedside table?
Well, my bedside table is a bit of a disgrace. Because I knew you were going to ask me this question, I went and counted the number of books that were piled up there. There are actually 23 books piled up there alongside, and which is ridiculous because I really only have time for reading when I go to bed, and I'm often very tired anyway, and manage, about a page or 2 pages if I'm lucky before I go under. So progress through a lot of those books is slow, but broadly speaking, I would always have some non-fiction there and some classics, and poetry for nights when I'm really tired and can't even manage a page of prose, and one poem will do it. Great lover of poetry, and some fiction there too, although perhaps less fiction than would be true for many readers. In a way, I prefer non-fiction. Of course, I'm a non-fiction writer, and I find non-fiction writing very, very interesting. But specifically, because I need to be honest, the book I'm reading at the moment is fiction. It's Thomas Hardie's Return of the Native, which is the first ever book I tackled for A-level, and I hadn't gone back to it ever since. And one thing that wine writers do is often describe landscapes. They have to describe landscapes. It's very important that they describe landscapes and a relationship with landscape. And this actually was something that Hardie does terrifically well. And in this particular book, almost the main character is the landscape itself, Egdon Heath. A lot of the action takes place. It's amazing, actually. A huge amount of the action takes place at night on the heath, with people moving around and overhearing each other and listening to each other. And I find that aspect of the book super fascinating. Other aspects I'm not quite so keen on. I hadn't realised that it was quite such a bodice ripper as it really is. But it's all done rather skillfully. He ties the narrative together with great deftness. And he's also a more ambitious writer than I realized when I first read it too. It's actually quite laboriously crafted, not quite Henry James, but halfway there. But as I say, the main attraction of the book, and one I really enjoyed rediscovering, is Hardie's relationship with and use of landscape in that particular fiction, the landscape of this Wessex heath, which he calls Egdon Heath.
Yeah, interesting. Mine is a little bit less highbrow than Hardie, I suppose. It's a book called The Match by Italian journalist Piero Trellini, and it basically describes this football match in 1982 between Italy and Brazil. We're recording this in the midst of the European Football Championships, and that's what really inspired me to pick up a copy of this book.
Very germane.
Yeah. I don't want to give anything away, but I think Italian fans will love it. Perhaps Brazilian readers will be less impressed. So what are you up to over the summer? Are you travelling outside of France, or are you going to stay local this summer?
Apart from a week at the end of summer, it'll be a working summer. I've been doing quite a lot of travelling this spring. I was recently in Italy, actually, in Montepellier. I enjoyed that enormously. And we'll be looking forward to writing about that in due course. I have to do 2 more work trips, in the next month and a half. One to Georgia and one to Latvia. Both countries I visit often. Georgia, obviously, fantastic wine producing culture. Although I'm going there to do judging. And then Latvia, I tend to do wine judging as well, and wine events, education, broadly speaking. I'll be doing those two work trips a little later. And then at the end of every summer, we go as a family to the Alps for a week, walking, perhaps 10 days if I can twist the arms of the rest of the family at the end of August. So I'm looking forward to that very much. I love being in the mountains, and I love walking up and down them, and the wonderful views in the air and the inspiration that they bring. So that will be a big pleasure at the end of summer.
Where can listeners follow you, Andrew, and more importantly, where can they get a copy of your books?
There are 3 places where my work appears regularly. One is Decanter magazine. I have a monthly column there and occasionally write features too. That is available both on and offline. There's World of Fine Wine magazine, where I have a column every month and quite often get involved in wine tastings and writing the introductions for those. I strongly recommend a subscription to that magazine, which is wine's principal cultural journal, I would say. If anybody doesn't know it, please look it out. You can look it up online and then subscribe through the website. It's only available by subscription, and it's 4 times a year. And nobody ever throws away a copy because it looks so beautiful. So that's another strong recommended place to catch up with what I'm writing. And then the final place is the UK political journal, The New Statesman. I'm writing a column there every month. And even if you're not able to obtain a copy of the magazine, I generally put a link to that up on LinkedIn, on my LinkedIn page or whatever it's called. So I link to that article too. And then as far as the books are concerned, well, all good bookshops is the standard phrase, and I hope it's true. But if not, Amazon is the fail-safe. And I did check on Amazon.com, the US version of Amazon, and both the books that are in print are all up there, as well as the New France, which is out of print. But there are, second-hand copies available there too, and I would imagine the same is true for Amazon.co.uk. So either of those sites would be an easy place to get hold of the books.
Yeah, both the ones I've read, certainly Drinking with the Valkyries and the Whisky Island Islay book are highly, highly recommended, really, for anyone with an interest in wine and or whiskey. Really, really excellent reads. Andrew, thank you very much for your time. You've been extremely generous with your time this morning. I hope to see you soon, perhaps in Verona one day.
Indeed.
Thanks again, Andrew.
Very much my pleasure, Richard. Thanks for getting in touch.
Ciao.
Okay, ciao. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining the Italian Wine Podcast Book Club. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get your pods.